rumors of Resident Evil 0 getting a remake in the near future, along with Code Veronica remake, I figured now is a good time as any to talk about the things that the remake will need to change about the original game. Because let's face it, while I am a big RE0 fan and I definitely like it more than some people out there, the game has a lot of problems that need to be addressed in the remake. So on this episode of Nerdspace Games, we're taking a look at the biggest changes that need to happen with Resident Evil 0 Remake. Note that I won't be including obvious things. Improved visuals, dialogue, acting, even modern over-the-shoulder third-person perspective are all things that are to be expected from the remake. Instead, I want to focus on elements of the game that may or may not be changed for the remake, but honestly, I believe it'll be for the better if they do change it. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Finally, I want to let you guys know that I finally have a Nerdspace game shop and it features our first ever design. I call it the Boulder Punching Collection. You can guess where I got that from, right? Anyway, pick up a sweater featuring this design just in time for winter. But yeah, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games and here are the 8 things that the Resident Evil 0 remake needs to change. Let's get it. Number 1, inventory box. One of the biggest complaints for the original game was the lack of an inventory box. See, RE0 decided to change up the RE formula a bit in multiple ways, including removing the infamous inventory box in favor of being able to drop items on the ground. In theory, this was supposed to add an additional level of strategy while also making things a tad bit more realistic than, say, a bunch of magical boxes that all somehow transfers all of your items from place to place. The only issue with this mechanic is that it created a ton, and I mean a ton of backtracking. And while backtracking might be one of the core features of classic survival horror games, Resident Evil 0 took that far beyond in the rest of the franchise due to the players constantly having to backtrack to find weapons or key items that they left behind. On top of that, this was already a pretty difficult game, especially on the harder difficulties, and with limited resources, backtracking for key items that you left behind made things even more challenging. This led to players ultimately being screwed over in situations as they'll end up at the final boss or other difficult areas of the game without enough resources to help them finish the game. So yeah, clearly this was a mistake, and if we do eventually get a remake of Resident Evil 0, adding an inventory box is a must. Side note, there is currently a mod on PC that actually adds the inventory box into the game, and it definitely makes the game a lot smoother, so there's proof that this change absolutely needs to happen with the remake. Number 2, the boss fights. While the older Resident Evil games didn't feature the most difficult boss fights, they still posed a decent threat and were a lot of fun to face off against. RE0 unfortunately doesn't meet those same standards. The biggest issue really comes from how laughably easy most of the bosses are in this game compared to the rest of the franchise. Stinger, aka a giant scorpion, just keeps crawling towards you, and every time you hit its weak spot, it just bounces back. This makes killing this boss probably one of the easiest bosses to kill with a knife only. The giant centipede later in the game is almost worse, as it just runs around the pool area in the exact same path over and over again, letting you easily dispose of it with whatever weapons you have. Even the Tyrant, one of the most intimidating monsters in the Resident Evil franchise, is absolutely pathetic in both boss fights of this game. And the boss fights that are somewhat difficult in this game are boring, broken, or uninteresting. Looking at you, Giant Bat and the Queen Leech. Yeah, Resident Evil 0 could use a massive upgrade in terms of the boss fights. I'm not saying it needs to have different bosses in the game, although I think they definitely should do that too, but rather they need to make these bosses more interesting than just having giant animals and insects walk around the room and do absolutely nothing. Number 3, Bravo Team. Something that I was originally hoping for when it came to the prequel to the original Resident Evil game was the fact that we would finally get to know the first STARS team that arrived in the Arklay Mountains, Bravo Team. See, in the original Nightmare, Chris and Joe arrived with Alpha Team looking for Bravo Team who went missing the night before. The lone survivor of Bravo Team, Rebecca Chambers, was set to be the main protagonist of this game, so a lot of fans had hoped that we would get to see things from the perspective of the entire Bravo Team in their final hours. Unfortunately, Richard, Enrico, and the rest of Bravo Team were mostly MIA throughout Resident Evil 0 as the game decided to introduce a new protagonist instead, Billy Cohen. Now look, I don't have anything against Billy Cohen, and I think it's way too late for the remake to completely just remove him from the game. However, what I'm hoping for when it comes to the remake of RE0 is that we get more scenes and interactions with members of Bravo Team prior to their death. We got a small taste of it with the scene featuring Enrico later in the game, but I wouldn't mind seeing Rebecca interact with some of her other comrades a bit more. Specifically, I would love to see her and Richard interact more, which is who I originally thought would make a great second protagonist before Billy Cohen was revealed. Number 4, the ending or post-game DLC. Spoilers for a game that's over 2 decades old now, but Resident Evil 0 ends on a weird note in which we're left with one of the biggest mysteries and unanswered questions of the franchise. What is the fate of Billy Cohen? See, at the end of the game, Rebecca Chambers takes Billy's dog tags and allows him to escape into the Arklay Mountains. Then, after surviving the Spencer Mansion incident, she reports him as deceased. However, from this point on, we never really hear from Billy Cohen again. This is an interesting point of discussion because you would think that after Billy escapes into the woods, he would be attacked by the same zombie dogs that attacked Alpha Team that same evening. And while Billy is definitely capable of surviving this attack, it's also kind of weird that he doesn't just go back and try to find Rebecca when he realizes that she might be in danger too. The way Resident Evil 0 ends, it leaves us wondering if Billy ever made it out of the mountains, and if he did, where did he go? So here's what I'm thinking. 1, the remake changes the ending. We get a more concrete answer as to what happened to Billy. Hell, I can easily see him sacrificing himself in this version of the game to save Rebecca. That would be way more poetic than him just disappearing for the rest of the franchise. The other option is that we get the same ending, but maybe at a later time, we get a post-game DLC that allows us to play as Billy as he escapes the mountains. Personally, I think the first option works the best and makes the most sense, but I love to hear what you guys think. Do you think the remake should change the ending of Resident Evil 0 Remake? And if so, how do you think Capcom should address this? Number 5, the campaign. As I said earlier, Resident Evil 0 changed up the formula a bit while still keeping a lot of the core elements of the classic Resident Evil games intact. However, another thing that was changed was the focus on 2 protagonists at once in a single campaign. See, before this game, RE1 and RE2 featured 2 scenarios. RE3 featured Jill Valentine with a small section for Carlos, and Code Veronica featured Jill for the first half and Chris for the second half of the game. Resident Evil 0 focused on 2 playable protagonists in the same campaign, similar to Code Veronica, but it also made them both controllable for a majority of the game. What I mean by that is that RE0 allowed you to switch between Rebecca and Billy at will, since they were with each other for a majority of the game. In fact, some puzzles needed to be solved by using them both together at times. It was a new mechanic that wasn't seen in previous Resident Evil games, but unfortunately I wasn't a fan of it at all. Because Billy and Rebecca were with each other almost the entire time, RE0 lacked any real anxiety and fear that we got from being alone in the Spencer Mansion, the RPD station, or even the streets of Raccoon City. So how should the remake change this? Well, there's one of 2 ways they could go about it. The first is the way that I would like to see it play out, and that's by featuring 2 separate campaigns. Do something along the same lines as Resident Evil 2, in which the protagonists do their own things, but from time to time they eventually interact with each other. Of course, this means that they'll need to expand the game some and create new puzzles so that the scenarios could feel different enough. The other option, and probably the most likely situation, is to make the game multiplayer. Create a Resident Evil 5 situation in which you can play the entire campaign with a friend. If you're going to take away the tension that comes with a protagonist being alone by keeping Billy and Rebecca together throughout the entire game, then you might as well just make it multiplayer. Number 6, exploring the forest. This is actually something that I wouldn't mind getting if we eventually got a Resident Evil 1 Remake 2.0. With such an iconic opening featuring the zombie dogs, it makes me wonder why Capcom hasn't allowed us to explore the forest surrounding the Spencer Mansion more. Well, if we do get this RE0 remake, Bravo Team, like Alpha Team in the first game, starts out by investigating a crash site in the Arklay Mountains. Instead of skipping to the section in which Rebecca Chambers enters the train, I think it would be pretty cool to have a section in which we see her investigating the forest first. Something about being in the woods at night is terrifying on its own, but when you add that setting to a Resident Evil game that features zombies and other creatures, yeah, that's a perfect recipe for a horror game in my opinion. I'm not expecting an open world to explore in the Arklay Mountains. In fact, I wouldn't want that at all. I'm thinking of something more along the lines of the campgrounds in Alan Wake 2. Something like that would be really cool and terrifying to explore, and it'll be the first time since Resident Evil Outbreak's flashback scenario since we actually got to explore some of the forest surrounding the Spencer Mansion. Number 7, more difficult puzzles. I'm a massive fan of puzzles, especially difficult ones, in my survival horror games. In fact, that's exactly why Tormented Souls and its sequel are 2 of my favorite survival horror games of all time. And while a lot of the earlier Resident Evil games have been great about iconic puzzles, most notably Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, sadly RE0 didn't really deliver fully in that department. Don't get me wrong, there's a few unique puzzles that I really liked in that game. For example, the food chain puzzle in the basement of the training facility is still one of the best puzzles of the franchise. However, most of the game didn't feature puzzles that hit that same highs as that one, and in the remake of RE0, I would love for them to increase the amount of puzzles and the difficulty of them. The perfect example that I can think of is Resident Evil 2 Remake in comparison to the original game. Looking at Resident Evil 2 OG, while that game is my favorite video game of all time, it lacked any difficult puzzles. Most of them a child could solve. In fact, I did solve them as a kid. However, the remake changed things up by introducing more difficult puzzles. For example, we got the night plugs riddle and the chemical puzzle. Granted, RE2 Remake still didn't have enough puzzles in my opinion, but it was still an improvement in comparison to the original game, and my hope is that Resident Evil 0 Remake could also improve on its original game in the puzzle department. Number 8, the music. It feels wrong coming after Resident Evil 0's soundtrack because quite honestly, I don't think it's all that bad. The save room music, while not my favorite in the franchise, is fantastic, and the battle music that plays when we come across a Memory Marcus is perfection. With that being said, the game lacks iconic room themes outside of the save room, and I'm not a fan of any of the boss themes like I was with Code Veronica and the original trilogy. This is something that I really think that the remake should make an effort to improve on, as the soundtrack for RE0 is honestly pretty forgettable. Like, besides Memory Marcus and the save room theme, how many tracks in that game do you guys remember? But when you look at, say, I don't know, RE2, you remember Mr. X's theme, the many different Birkin themes, room themes like the main hall of the RPD station and the library, and much more. My hope is that when we get a Resident Evil 0 remake, we get a soundtrack that's a little more memorable and one that features a lot more tracks that stick with us long after we finish the game, not just 2 of them like we got with the original game. But that does it for this episode of Nerdspace Games. Do you think we'll get a Resident Evil 0 remake, and if so, what changes would you like to see made with the remake? Let me know all of your thoughts down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerdspace Games. Take care.